So, good morning everybody. I'm going to report today on some ongoing research at the Westphal Neuroimaging Lab in the Division of Perceptual Studies, also known as DOPS, at the University of Virginia. Just a little background, DOPS was founded in 1967 by the late Dr. Ian Stevenson, and was originally known as the Division of Parapsychological Studies. So Ian Stevenson is mostly known for his work in reincarnation. That work is still ongoing to this day. It's being carried forward. A little bit of a shameless plug for some of the publications that have been coming out of DOPS lately. Science, the Self, and Survival After Death is a summary of some of Ian Stevenson's writings, including but not limited to his reincarnation work. Jim Tucker, who's now the head of DOPS, has got a couple books out. One, Life Before Life, is a review of all the DOPS research done on children who have past life memories. Jim's most recent book, Return to Life, has got a number of interesting American cases of children with past life memories. And it's really quite an interesting read. Bruce Grayson, who was the head of the division for many years, has edited the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. NDEs is Bruce's area of research. Irreducible Mind is an all-out attack on classical physicalism, and is a classic book in and of itself, edited by Ed Kelly and Emily Kelly and company. And the follow-up to that is Beyond Physicalism. It's a theory-oriented book looking at what the constructs of humans might be when mystical experiences and psi phenomena are taken into account. So right across the hall from DOPS, under the auspices of Cedar Creek Institute, DOPS' sister organization, is the Westphal Neuroimaging Lab, where I'm working. The lab is dedicated to the psychophysiological study of altered states of consciousness in psi. It's a relatively new lab. We just got underway really about 2010. One of our goals is to identify physiological conditions conducive to success in psi tasks. The facility boasts an electromagnetically shielded room, pretty spacious one that meets the CIA Tempest specification for 100 dB of shielding and a bandwidth of 20 kilohertz to 10 gigahertz. We have a 128 channel EEG that's also capable of recording auxiliary channels such as EOG, GSR, EKG, skin potential, etc. There's a remote agent room in a separate floor of the building with audio-visual capability, which we are using for telepathy and OBE type studies. And we have a now installed and functioning software base for automated protocols and psi testing. We also have a set of multiple sensors for PK testing, which I'm going to describe a little bit more in a minute. But first, I would like to put out a plea that if you know of advanced meditators, OBE practitioners, advanced healers, trance mediums, PK and ESP experts who are interested in engaging in scientific research, please direct them our way. You can find us by doing a search of DOPS UVA or CCI UVA on the web, and you get to those websites, there's directions on how to contact our staff from there. So I mentioned we have an array of various sensors. These are 24 channels that are simultaneously sampled with the physiological data. There are several different types of sensors. These are oriented towards our PK studies. For example, a bank of resistors, a 3-axis magnetometer, 4 channels of piezoelectric force detector, a electric field monitor, a Geiger counter, temperature sensors. We're also monitoring temperature and humidity in the shielded room. And then we have a class of, an odd class of sensors that I guess could best be described as slow rate event generators. Just as an aside at this point, I have to tell you what the bias of the experimenter / engineer, i.e. me, is in these types of experiments. I noticed with interest yesterday Bill Bankston talking about the healing. It's not PK, it's just something that's happening. We probably have a slightly different approach in this, and that's partly based on my own personal experience. I attended a PK party many years ago that Jack Houck, an engineer from McDonnell Douglas, was giving. And in that party, I witnessed firsthand some pretty amazing metal bending. In fact, I got to experience it myself. I was standing there with a spoon and 2 people on either side of me chanting, "Bend, bend, bend." And I felt that spoon momentarily turn into taffy, and I got 2 complete 360-degree twists, spiral twists in the thing before it got stiff again. Afterwards, I took a spoon that was exactly the same type and tried doing that by force alone, and the thing snapped before it ever reached 90 degrees. I also witnessed that day, aside from lots of other people bending, I saw a little old lady take a 3/8-inch steel rod and get a 45-degree bend in that thing. And I know for a fact, trying it personally and several other people, you cannot bend that steel rod by physical force alone. So, I mean, here we have smoking gun evidence that through intention, people are able to affect the molecular structure of metal. And that's kind of directed my efforts in making PK sensors and PK research. So I tried to build electronic devices that would maybe somehow pick up or respond to what a metal bender is doing and turn that into electrical signal that then we can then monitor simultaneously with our physiological monitoring. I was working on something like that when I discovered quite by accident that the device, the electronic circuit, was generating these random events, the event being defined as one of these sharp edges. An edge like that we would define as an event. These things are appearing at random intervals. They also have different amplitudes. I didn't really want them in there. I thought that was a problem with this circuit. But I accidentally noticed in doing some of our experiments that these events seem to be appearing in groups or more often when people were directing their attention towards the device. So that caught my attention, and I started going around doing a little bit of observational research with this thing, working with groups, with healers and whatnot, and noticing that more of these events were appearing. For example, with healers, when the healer was working on a person and they would have some sort of breakthrough, it seemed like more of these events were appearing. Of course, that was just observational, practically anecdotal. And the event rates on these things was extremely slow. I will get back to that in a minute. Just a little bit of detail on these events, though. As I mentioned, they're slow. It takes about 1/4 of a second for an average event to get the full rise time. And based on what we know about what's going on in the circuit, these events are appearing in conjunction with about 25,000 electrons sloshing around. So if indeed these things are responding somehow to a tension, it's a tension that's moving on average about 25,000 electrons. The amplifier noise floor is 100 the equivalent of 100 electrons, so we have a pretty good signal-to-noise ratio with this device. A little bit more about it, we did some work on the distribution of event intervals, found that it was exponentially distributed, with the scale factor being equal to the inverse of the measured mean rate of events, indicating it's a Poisson process. I can't go into too much more detail about it because at this point we decided to make that little circuit proprietary in order to possibly maybe get more funding out of it somehow down the road. But nonetheless, and if you'll notice, the measured mean rate, 0.012 events per second, is extremely slow. So in order to make this device a little bit more amenable to research, they decided to start adding channels and making multiple channel devices to get the event rates up. What happened was we ended up with a device that looks like this. Inside each of those little boxes are multiple channels with those event sensors in them, or event generators. In effect, we have a PK target that's kind of spread out over space. The whole thing is electrically shielded, extremely well shielded, and then the little boxes are mounted inside a second RF shielded box with special RF shielding on the cables that run into the box. That's the device we used to use in an MRI scanner, so I know it's running about 130 dB of electrical shielding. The device is battery operated, as is all the physiological monitoring. Everything is isolated from power and earth ground. And we ran a rather long series of tests on this device looking for what kinds of environmental influences might be affecting it. We tested for electric and magnetic fields. We looked especially at background radiation and cosmic radiation, because in a way, this thing looks like a poor man's ionization chamber. But we could find no correlation with a Geiger counter set up right next to it. Still doing more work on that, but so far the only correlation to an environmental variable that I have found with this thing is humidity. So I took this box out in the field, as I mentioned earlier, and worked with groups. I took it to the Monroe Institute and worked with PK groups there. Again, worked with healers. I went to Norm Hansen's, did some work with him in the torsion pendulum. And I got data that was, again, kind of observational, suggestive. We had some statistics. We got statistical significance. It was a little loose in terms of timing and things like that. But we were coming up with p-values that were well below 0.05 for comparing baselines against periods of time when people were trying to affect this device. Originally, in the early days, we were manually scoring events. We had a lab tech who was doing that. She went and found another job. So we switched over to automated scoring. So here's a record of 2 channels of the device with some automated scoring marks in it. And what we are doing is pulling out not only timing but amplitude information. So the score that we're using right now is a so-called weighted event count. We're getting the events by sliding an average slope filter across the data. When it hits one of those events, it pops up like this, but it remains well behaved on the decay down the other side. So, with that all in mind, we decided to put this thing to the test in the lab and see what it would do running a very controlled, tightly controlled PK task with participants who were wired to EEG at the same time. One other item of interest on this thing, we found that a multi-channel stack device, like I was showing you, would be independent, would have independent observations if we used a segment of the record of 8 seconds. Anything less than 8 seconds and we start getting some dependence in the records. So as you can see in autocorrelation plots showing that at 8-second intervals these things are independent. And that works out pretty well with physiological monitoring. You can use 8-second windows for power spectral analysis of EEG. So we set the device up in the lab, put it in the corner, as you can see there. This is the view that a participant in our experiment would see. And we ran a pilot study. It's this pilot study that I'm going to report on here today. The pilot study was set up with a block type design, which means that it was run as a series of REST and PK trials, set up in an ABBA type sequence, very similar to a D-Mills type experiment. We have to run these comparing baselines against task conditions because there's really no set statistics on this device like you would see with a bitstream RNG where you're getting an expected value, say, of 100 for 200 bits sampled. The trials are audio paced, so our participant would be sitting there wired up to EEG and they hear audio commands generated by a computer telling them to either rest or engage in PK. They get feedback at the end of each trial and as a short burst tone of a tone, excuse me, indicating whether or not they got more events in the trial than in the previous trial. We started out initially with 3-minute trial lengths, thinking, okay, that's kind of like what we're doing out in the field. It takes people a little while to get their mojo up and running, and found out after a while that 3-minute trial lengths are absolutely torture for an individual who's sitting there running multiple trials. So we gradually shortened them, and we ended up settling on 48-second trial lengths. Okay, what happened? We ran 68 runs with humans. We had 7 significant outcomes. The significant outcome is defined as having a p-value less than 0.05 in a two-tailed bootstrapped resampled t-test comparing those event-weighted, amplitude-weighted event counts in PK versus rest conditions. Now, based on the binomial distribution, assuming chance success, the probability of getting that is 0.03. However, several of our hits were much less than 0.05 p-value. So that's a conservative estimate of the significance of this trial run. We found out a few other things from this pilot study. One is that the trial length actually didn't seem to make much difference in terms of their success. We got about equal numbers of hits with the longer trials versus the shorter trials. The same goes with feedback. Really didn't seem to make much difference. So, but from talking with our participants, it was clear shorter trial lengths were preferred, and the feedback made the whole experiment much more interesting for participants. We basically had 3 participants who were running the bulk of this experiment, 54 of the runs with 4 of the hits. But we had several other participants scoring hits, and one of those, before I get to that, I have to mention that we ran 25 control runs, was basically running the protocol without anybody in the room, with no significant outcomes. This was all actually rather surprising to me to see this in action. We tried controlling for experimenter effect by clearing out the control area of all personnel during an experimental run, moving everybody to an outer room where we had a video monitor showing a live feed of the participant in the experiment. This was done for safety reasons, and also an indication of the trial number, so we would know when the experiment was finished. So I want to now go to part 2 of this and show you some of the EEG results that we found. We're still just really getting into the EEG study of this pilot study, but one of the first ones we looked at was a pretty good hit. He got P of 0.007, and we happened to get a full 128 channel EEG. This was done on a person who was probably the closest to a professional PK agent in existence. It's Joe Gallenberger, who runs PK courses at the Monroe Institute, teaching people manifestation in PK. He also runs groups to Las Vegas, where they get to test their PK in action in the casinos. And Joe's a great EEG subject. He knows how to sit very quietly while he's doing his PK effort. And I should mention that EEG is quite a difficult thing to do on people who are engaged in any kind of activity that might involve movement. Any kind of movement artifact will completely disrupt an EEG, such as swallowing, talking, moving your head, blinking your eyes, having a little muscle tension from grimacing and whatnot, which makes it very difficult to run these types of experiments. And I would say that Joe was a model subject, which in a minute you're going to see is important to what we found in his EEG. So actually, before I get to this part, the first thing we did was look at his raw EEG, and we found that there were maybe 3 or 4 bad channels, and threw those out. We saw no gross movement artifact. We saw a little bit of eye movement artifact. We easily got rid of that just using a 3 Hertz high-pass filter. And we saw a tiny bit of muscle tension on some of the temporal electrodes in the PK trials. Didn't seem to be significant, looked like just a few electrodes. And the first analysis we ran is a thing called global, which takes all the high density array and collapses it down to just 3 measures, amplitude, frequency, and complexity. And what we found was that there was a significant difference between PK and rest for the amplitude and the frequency measures, but not the complexity measure. And those amplitude and frequency measures were both higher in the PK mode. So the next step in the analysis was to take a look at averaged power spectrum, which is what this is. We averaged all the PK trials in the frequency domain, averaged all the rest trials in the frequency domain, subtracted the rest from the PK, and came up with this result. I should explain what this graph, this is starting off in the left frontal area, moving around the left side of the head. Here we get to about the left occipital, and then into the right occipital, right temporal, and to right frontal. This frequency right here is 10 Hertz. So at first blush, what you're seeing is what looks like some activation going on in his PK mode in alpha, in this left frontal area and in the occipital area. And then a somewhat bizarre asymmetrical theta active. It's right on the alpha theta border here on the right side. Now the question is, at this point, is any of this statistically significant? I'll get to that in a minute. What we also see is this stuff right here, and these are temporal electrodes. Now this is about 28 hertz. So the question at this point is this neural origin or is this muscle artifact? And it's actually a bit of a conundrum for EEG studies when you get up into the high frequency ranges, is how much of what you're looking at is neural and how much is muscle tension on the scalp. The smoking gun in this is that it's on the temporal electrodes. So one would suspect that maybe this is a muscular origin. So one strategy for dealing with this is to just get rid of these electrodes from the analysis. Okay, so that's what I did, and I went on to look at a statistical analysis of the electrodes comparing PK to rest. Let's see here. And I started off by doing this in bands. So the theta band is defined as, in this case, is 4 to 8 hertz. What we found in 4 to 8 hertz was these red dots mark electrodes that were significantly different between PK and rest. This green stuff is just markers for the montage. So, in the statistical sense, there's really not much happening for Joe in the theta band. And that weird kind of asymmetry that showed up in the spectral plot was really not significant. Moving on to the alpha band, this sort of looks a little bit more like what we saw in the spectral plot. There's a alpha frequency activation going on that left side occipital area. Moving up to the beta band, now things are starting to spread out. You see some in the frontal areas and more occipital stuff. And this beta band is defined as 12 to 20 hertz. So again, the question arises here, how much of this is muscle, how much of this is actual brain activity? One hint of this is that the amplitude weighted average frequency in this band for these activations was about 15 hertz. Now, I had taken out the temporal electrodes for this analysis, but we're not seeing anything else showing up, although we do see stuff up here, and we do see some stuff here. So is it muscle or is it brain? And the way folks have been dealing with some of this is to use ICA to filter out frequency components from EEG. We haven't done that analysis yet, but in the reports I've seen using ICA for this, the results were inconclusive. Basically, they were able to say, oh yeah, we see muscle here, but they weren't able to actually take it out of the EEG and filter it. Moving up to high beta, which was defined as 20 to 35 hertz, now we're seeing even more of this stuff. So again, is muscle leaking into other electrodes and you just can't see it in the gross charts? I don't know. And finally, of great interest is the gamma band, which is, in our case, defined as 35 to 45 hertz. And we're getting somewhat of a similar distribution of significant electrodes, once again. And in this case, this amplitude weighted average frequency was right around 39 or 40 hertz. Very narrowly distributed, right around that frequency. Now this is of great interest to us because there have been other studies. The first one was in 1958, Das and Gastaud, who went to a hotel in Nepal and recorded EEGs from advanced meditators. and found that they were producing high frequency gamma. And these guys were very careful, had a lot of reasons that they put forth as to why what they were looking at was not muscle, that it truly was brain origin. And we would be quite interested to find that if a person who was successful at a PK task was at the same time producing gamma. That would be of great interest to us. There's another study, the Vipassana meditators producing occipital gamma. And in that one, they did have to wrestle a bit with the muscle issue. I know from personal experience, I used to work on a project where we were doing combined EEG and fMRI imaging. And in one of our trips demoing our system, we were talking with the researchers who mentioned, oh, they had been running EEG studies on Tibetan meditators. And these guys were producing what sounded utterly fantastic to me. It was quite high frequency stuff, around 70 hertz, extremely high amplitude, maybe a couple hundred microvolts, and distributed only in one particular area of the head. They didn't think it was muscle, but they weren't sure. So they were going to do, they wanted to do combined EEG and fMRI scanning to get to the bottom of it. I think we're faced with the same situation here. One of our best subjects had just a little bit of muscle tension. We're getting something that looks like maybe he has gamma activation, occipitally, with a little bit of stuff on the top of the head, similar to what was seen in the Vipassana meditators. But we don't know, is that stuff muscle or is it EEG? Now we do have the capability to do combined imaging. We could put a person in an MRI scanner and run 64 channels of EEG. However, if you think about that, for a PK study, an MRI scanner, I mean, it's not, first of all, it's not a very friendly environment for a PK agent to work in. But secondly, I have to admit, if I were the PK agent and I was trying to do PK and I was in an MRI scanner, yeah, I would be a little bit worried about maybe some of that PK getting loose and doing something to the scanner. You know? So anyway, that's about where it stands today. I think one of the most interesting things that has fallen out of this pilot study for us is what we're up against in terms of our participants and what they're doing while we've got them wired up to EEG. Several of the other EEGs I've just started to look at from our pilot study were nowhere near as good as Joe's. I mean, folks are in there and they're just, you know, they're doing all kinds of stuff. They're moving their hands, they're grimacing, they're doing anything they can to get that PK, to get that tone to bounce up for them at the end of the trial. When that happens, we have to throw data out. You know, if there's gross artifact, we have to throw it out. And I have to admit, as the experimenter who's gone to great effort to get that data, I don't want to throw it out. but we're faced with that dilemma. So moving forward in the study, as we go into more formal studies, one of the first things we're doing is we're sort of upping the ante in terms of how you get into the study. Now, all the folks in this pilot study were enrolled based on simply their interest in PK. So some of them had experiences, others hadn't. Some were professionals like Joe, others were just kind of interested in it. Going forward, we're only going to enroll people in the formal part of the study if they've actually produced, say, hits in a screening trial that we've run, or if they can affect hits on the system remotely. I didn't mention, but we've been running remote trials with the system as well. We've got it set up on Skype so a person can see a real-time display of the raw signals, and they hear the feedback as well. And we've actually had people get significant hits with this system from 250 miles away, which, yes, I admit, kind of blew my mind too, but there it is. So again, the plea, if you know of anybody that's routinely bending spoons and wants to engage in scientific study at the Dobbs Lab in Charlottesville, please direct them our way. And I think I got 3 minutes left, but I'll stop now. Okay, so, thank you.
Okay, there's a phenomenon called torsion energies, and guys like Claude Swanson thinks that that's subtle energy, torsion, chi are all the same thing. And there's things such as torsion generators. Might be interesting to see what happens with regard to your setup to something of that nature. So I just thought it was interesting because there's maybe some similarities, and I also know some people who bend spoons.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you bring that up because I have read Claude's book about torsion wave. I did find it very interesting, and I actually visited Claude a couple of years ago with that black box, and he set up with one of his torsion generators, and we ran a series of controlled trials, and we actually did come up with more events showing up when that torsion generator was on. It was a big wheel that was spinning at high speed. The thing that confused me about it was I couldn't tell, since Claude and I were both sitting there and we knew the conditions of the trial, we weren't blind, whether it was just sort of inadvertent experimenter effect or whether it was actually a torsion generator.
When you described the initial development of your circuit and explained how you were seeing what you had taken to be random errors of some sort until you noticed that they seemed to be happening more frequently during intentional or healing efforts, I had to restrain myself from getting up and dancing because back in 2008 at the Utrecht conference on the future of parapsychology, one of the things I pointed out in my presentation is that off-the-shelf electronic components are automatically going to be inadvertently psi-hardened because electrical engineers don't track their thoughts and emotions. And if something is responding to mental effects under development, that will be classed as intermittent faults, and they'll do their best to engineer them out. And if they can't get rid of them, they won't market it. So I'd like to express my gratitude that you were an competent, skillful electrical engineer who also knew about psi phenomena and was actively working for them. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I have to admit, when I first saw that stuff, the first thing I thought of was get rid of this circuit, but...
Right.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
A colleague of mine, Wagner Allegredi from the IEC, has recently done some pilot work in fMRI, producing a bioenergetic field, mobilizing bioenergies or chi or prana, whatever you want to call it, and trying to look for the neural correlates of this. And what they found was a lot of activation outside of the brain, which was suggestive of not brain activity, of course, but perhaps bioenergetic, you could say noise in this case. They then went in, they scanned it with a phantom, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and he exteriorized through his hands into the phantom and did block design, exteriorization, no exteriorization, and they saw huge effects of this. So my thought on this is that perhaps there's a third alternative, not muscle noise, not necessarily neuronal activity, but a bioenergetic artifact of the field that's being produced that might be conducive for the PK.
Interesting point.
So I wonder if, I don't know, if we don't have a great apparatus to directly measure bioenergy, unfortunately. But I think that could also be the link between some of these meditators that are producing these kind of high frequency bioenergetic fields, or coherent, self-coherent fields that are being read as neural activity.
Actually, I just saw John Kruth raising his hand going, yes, we do. He's about to give a talk about
All
that.
right,
So.
cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you had spoken with, I think his name was John, your advanced PK agent, or Joe, I'm not quite sure. Joe.
Joe Gallenberg.
Did you speak with him about how he goes about doing his PA activity and how it differs from the other subjects that you worked with?
Yeah, in fact, that's a huge subject, and Joe goes into that in depth in his courses, and I think it, just in a nutshell, he's talking about opening the heart chakra when he does it. One other quick thing about Joe, just a quick aside, I have seen him also show that he, and this goes to the point that you were making, he seems to be able to generate very high voltages on his body. Now he does that, he demonstrates it by taking a round fluorescent tube, and he'll hold it and flick it, and you'll see the thing light up. A person could say, oh, that's just static charge, but he showed this to me in a very damp basement on a very hot, damp night. There was no static, and he also says that he can do it in a shower with water running on him. And there was a study done at the Menninger Institute with meditators and healers. They had set up a special facility with a very insulated chair and electric field detectors around people, and they were measuring what they thought was pushing about 80 volts or so on some people. So it's, you know, it's possible Joe's generating a high voltage field, and that's part of the reason we set up these electric field monitors and whatnot, and we're trying to pursue that with him as well.
Yeah, I hate to be the skeptic in the group, but I'm a member of the International Remote Viewing Association, and I have been to all of their meetings since 2001, with the exception of 2. And the first 1 or 2, I believe, had Jack Houck and his spoon-bending parties. I was at both of those, and then after he no longer was healthy enough to do that, Lynn Buchanan's. All those years, I have never yet witnessed a spoon bending that I thought was done without just physical force. And I've walked around with my camera, I've looked very carefully. I don't know if I'm just moving in a different reality than everybody else. You know, there are piles of bent spoons and forks, you know, in the middle of the floor, but I have yet to witness one. Now, I know Russell Targ and I think Dean Radin both have claimed that they had spoons bent when they were not thinking hard about it, and others. But I'd love to witness one.
See, that's the interesting thing about my experience. I would probably be in the same camp as you, except for that little lady with the steel rod. But I actually felt that darn thing turn into taffy. You know, I don't think for a minute I was the PK agent. There's 2 other people sitting there chanting along with me. I felt that thing turn into taffy just briefly. And it just almost fell into place, 2 complete spiral twists on it, and then it got stiff again.
Believer, I think that would make me a believer as well.
Yeah.
But it must be a very rare incident, it seems to me.
That's one of the problems with it. It's kind of rare, isn't it?
Back here that went to a party with a bunch of secretaries. Are we done? Anyway, she said she was the only one that couldn't bend the spoon, so apparently it, you know, depends.
Thank you.